Said you mentioned the elephant birth rates. If anyone has questions about that, you can go to our USA website, creationresearchusa.org. We've got information sheets. They're sort of like the fact files, and one of them is on the population growth of elephants and
Oh,
how
good.
it would be easily in the millions by the time of this ice age that's predicted by these creationists weather models that show that it happened 200 to 700 years after the flood. I'd also add, yes, I've worked a lot on the Loess soils up on the Loess Plateau in China, the Loess soils in America, and these are always just down below where the ice sheets and glaciers would have been across the northern continents. And if you remember when I talked about the black soil region and these beautiful black soils, well, that was in these grassland prairies. That was working in the southern part of this Siberian plain where all of these woolly mammoths would have been. And what produced that black soil was that these were grassland prairies, deep, deep black soils. Now, even today, they still freeze to a meter and a half every winter. But then in the summer, they're back to being these beautiful grasslands. And it's the most productive region in all China. It's the only region of China where they produce more food than they consume, and they export from that region. And that goes all the way up into Russia, into Siberia. So it would have been an ideal area for these woolly mammoths and all the other animals associated with it. I'd also say interesting things about the Loess soils. What Michael Lloyd had said was that you get these massive windstorms. Well, winds governed by the temperature differential. So you've got these ice sheets of cold water, cold air, and then you've got these areas down below that are heating up. You're going to have massive winds. Well, in North America, we had our Dust Bowl era, and it buried houses, it buried animals, and so he's proposing that these woolly mammoths were standing in place and were buried, and that's why they many times have broken legs trying to fight their way out of them.
That's it. Yeah, I forgot to mention that. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is the Loess soils aren't usually the sands; they're usually fine silts, and it has got the highest capillary capacity to draw water up from below, and so this water then would be capillary action, rising the water up, wicking the water up, and then freezing them in place. So it's a perfect scenario for getting these woolly mammoths to be frozen in place. You got a big storm event, they get buried, they sit there buried after they're dead, and then comes the next winter, and that moisture that's now risen up into that silt loam soil is going to freeze. And then you find a woolly mammoth frozen in place, and you're thinking, now how did it get down into the permafrost?
That's great, Glenn. That really adds a lot. And it's just one of these examples of where there's a mass extinction that's not a result of the flood. It's a result of post-flood processes.
Yes.
And one of the other things I meant to mention was I briefly mentioned it was the massive flooding that occurred as a result of the ice melt.
Yes.
And many people would be familiar that are listening here today of the Lake Missoula flood. I think that's pretty widely recognised now as a massive regional flood. There's another one that's lesser known in the Siberian area. I think it's called the Lake Og flood. There's many major rivers that are coming out of Siberia now. And there's others even in Tasmania where we are. I've seen evidences of at the base of gorges coming off the Central Highlands where there's massive erosion channels well away from the rivers and big floodplains at the end of them where quite possibly water trapped on top of the highlands in a melt has burst forth down through a gorge and carved out all of these channels at the bottom.
Yeah, the world that we live in today is not the world of the past, and you can't take what we measure today and extrapolate to the past because it was radically different. I always wondered about how the promised land was this land of flowing with milk and honey. It was totally different then. It probably, at that time, you're talking at the end of the ice age, was much wetter. And as we talked about last week, the key nutrient is water. It's why Australia, when they do get rains, it greens up. You just don't get rains that often. I went to Death Valley here in America, the lowest spot, I think the lowest spot in the world, the highest temperatures in the world. My wife had been to it previously and just said it's ugly, it's dead, it's just ugly. There's nothing alive. And I went to it after a rain, and it was just covered in vegetation, one of the prettiest places I've ever seen in my life. It was just solid flowers everywhere because there was water. Well, what took place after the ice age was ending? You've got these lush areas, but climate changed, and it's desert today.
Yeah. And keep in mind too, I mentioned the time of Joseph and the 7-year drought, and how his family had to travel down to Egypt in that drought from Canaan, which 400 or 500 years later, when Moses is going back to it, it is lush again. So climate change, and it goes up and it goes down, and it was a dramatic drought, and there was a dramatic recovery after that.
Yes. And it's all, when it comes to vegetation, it's all about the water. You can grow plants without soil. I hate to say that as a soil scientist, but you can.